It's December 1944. The snow-covered forests of Belgium. The largest battle the American army would ever fight is raging all around. And in the middle of all this chaos, something absolutely unthinkable happens. A United States Army general, one star gleaming on his shoulder, finds himself staring down the barrels of German rifles. This shouldn't be possible. Generals don't get captured. They're supposed to be miles behind the lines, safe in headquarters, pushing pins around maps. But here he is, Brigadier General Alan W. Jones, and his capture is about to become one of the most controversial and heartbreaking stories of World War II. Welcome back, everyone. Today we're diving into a story that most history books gloss over or ignore completely. It's got everything: massive military blunders, a father's worst nightmare, impossible decisions, and a moment that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. This is the story of how the Germans captured an American general during the Battle of the Bulge, but trust me, it's so much more than that. So settle in, because this one's going to take some twists you won't see coming. Let's set the stage properly. It's mid-December 1944. If you're sitting in Allied headquarters, you're feeling pretty good about how the war is going. D-Day happened back in June. Paris was liberated in August. The Allies are pushing into Germany itself. Everyone's talking about how the war might be over by Christmas. There's this feeling in the air, this confidence, maybe even a little bit of overconfidence, that Germany is beaten. They're finished. It's just a matter of time now. The Allied front line stretches hundreds of miles, from the North Sea down to Switzerland. And along that line, there's this one section that's considered quiet, really quiet. It's called the Ardennes, a heavily forested, hilly region that straddles Belgium, Luxembourg, and Germany. The Allied commanders have decided to thinly hold this sector. Why? Because the terrain is terrible for tanks, the roads are narrow and winding, and they figure there's no way the Germans would be crazy enough to attack there. They're wrong. Spectacularly, catastrophically wrong. Now let me introduce you to the men at the center of our story. First, there's Major General Alan W. Jones. He's the commander of the 106th Infantry Division, one of the greenest, most inexperienced divisions in the entire American Army. These guys literally just arrived in Europe. Most of them have never heard a shot fired in anger. They're kids, really, fresh out of training camps in America, and they've been sent to the Ardennes precisely because it's supposed to be a quiet sector where they can get their feet wet without too much danger. Jones himself is 54 years old, a career officer, competent but not flashy. He's got grey hair, a serious face, and the weight of command sitting heavy on his shoulders. But here's the thing that's going to tear your heart out. Jones has a son, Alan W. Jones, Jr. And Jr. is a first lieutenant serving in the very same division his father commands. Father and son, both in the Ardennes, both about to face the nightmare of their lives. The 106th Division is holding a section of the line that includes an area called the Schnee Eifel, which is German for snow mountain. It's a ridge that actually juts into German territory, creating what military people call a salient, a bulge in the line. Two of the division's three regiments, the 422nd and the 423rd, are dug in along this ridge. About 9,000 men total. They're cold, they're bored, and they have no idea what's coming. Here's what they don't know. On the other side of the forest, hidden under the trees and camouflaged with incredible discipline, the Germans have assembled an absolutely massive force. 3 entire armies, 25 divisions, 250,000 men, over 1,000 tanks. Hitler himself has planned this operation. It's his last desperate gamble to split the Allied armies, capture the vital port of Antwerp, and force the Western Allies to negotiate peace. He's scraped together every reserve unit, every tank, every soldier he can find, and he's aimed them all at one spot, the Ardennes, the quiet sector, the place where green American troops are holding the line. At 5:30 in the morning on December 16, 1944, all hell breaks loose. The Germans open up with the largest artillery barrage the Western Front has seen since 1918, thousands of guns firing all at once. The American positions are hammered with high explosive shells. The young soldiers of the 106th Division huddle in their foxholes, terrified, as the world explodes around them. They've never experienced anything like this. Nothing in training prepared them for this level of violence, this sustained thunder of artillery that seems to go on forever. When the barrage finally lifts, German infantry comes pouring through the forest, not in the open fields where they'd be easy targets, but through the trees, using the terrain, moving fast. The American line ruptures in multiple places. Communications start breaking down immediately. Phone lines are cut by the shelling. Radio reports are confused and contradictory. The fog of war descends thick and heavy. General Jones is at his headquarters in St. Vith, a small Belgian town about 8 miles behind the front lines. The reports coming in are fragmentary and terrifying. His division is under massive attack. The Germans are everywhere. Units are being surrounded. The 2 regiments on the Schnee-Eifel, the 422nd and 423rd, those 9,000 men, they're in serious trouble. The Germans haven't attacked them directly. Instead, they've done something much more clever and much more deadly. They've attacked around them, on both sides, flowing past like water around a rock. Within 24 hours, those 2 regiments are cut off, completely surrounded, deep behind enemy lines. Jones is faced with an impossible decision. Does he order those 9,000 men to abandon their positions and try to fight their way back to American lines, or does he tell them to hold their positions and wait for relief? Remember, Jones is a father, and his son is out there somewhere in that chaos. But he's also a general, and he has to think about the entire division, the entire battle. The decision he makes will be second-guessed for decades. He orders them to hold, stay in position, dig in, relief is coming. It's not an unreasonable decision given the information he has. The doctrine says you don't abandon prepared positions. You hold key terrain. A relief force is supposedly being organized. Supplies will be airdropped, just hold on, but the relief force never materializes. The supplies never come. The weather turns bad and the planes can't fly. And those 9,000 men are stuck on that ridge, surrounded, running low on ammunition, low on food, freezing in the snow. December 17th, December 18th, the situation deteriorates rapidly. The entire Ardennes front is in chaos. The Germans are punching deep into Allied territory, towns are falling, American units are retreating in confusion, and St. Vith, where General Jones has his headquarters, is now right in the path of the German advance. Jones is being pressed from multiple directions. His surrounded regiments are calling for help. His headquarters is about to be overrun. The whole division is falling apart around him. On the morning of December 19th, German forces break through into St. Vith itself. The headquarters personnel, clerks and cooks and radio operators, grab rifles and try to defend the town, but it's hopeless. The Germans have tanks, they have artillery, they have overwhelming force. Jones is ordered to evacuate immediately. He has to abandon his command post and pull back further west. It's chaos, a complete rout. Staff officers are burning documents, destroying equipment, piling into jeeps and trucks, and fleeing down icy roads with German shells landing all around them. And somewhere in all this madness, Jones makes the most painful decision of his life. He finally authorizes his 2 surrounded regiments to try and break out. But it's too late, way too late. They're out of ammunition, they're out of food, they're surrounded by German forces that have had days to tighten the noose. On December 19th, after a brief, hopeless attempt to fight their way out, the 422nd and 423rd Infantry Regiments surrender. 9,000 men lay down their weapons and become prisoners of war. It's the largest mass surrender of American forces in the European theater, a catastrophe. But here's where our story takes a personal turn that makes it even more tragic. Remember General Jones's son, Lieutenant Allen Jones Jr.? He was with one of those regiments. When they surrendered, he became a prisoner. The general's son is now in German hands. Can you imagine what's going through Jones's mind at this moment? He gave the order to hold. He's the one who decided they should stay in position instead of pulling back. And now his own son is paying the price for that decision. The guilt must have been absolutely crushing. But wait, I told you this story was about a general being captured, right? We're getting there, because Jones's nightmare isn't over yet, not even close. After evacuating St. Vith, Jones and what's left of his division headquarters are in full retreat. They're trying to establish a new defensive line further west, trying to reorganize the shattered remnants of the 106th Division. Jones is probably in shock. His division has been destroyed. His son is captured. Everything has fallen apart in less than a week, and he's still trying to command, still trying to do his duty, even as his world crumbles around him. In the confusion of the retreat, with units scattered all over the countryside, with communications broken down, with German forces seemingly everywhere, Jones and a small group of staff officers find themselves increasingly isolated. They're moving through the Belgian countryside, trying to link up with friendly forces, trying to figure out where the front lines even are anymore. Because here's the thing about the Battle of the Bulge. The Germans pushed so fast that there really wasn't a front line in the traditional sense. There were pockets of American resistance, German spearheads racing west, and huge areas where nobody was really sure who controlled what. On December 20th, just one day after his regiment surrendered, Jones and his small party are making their way through the snow near a small Belgian village. They're in jeeps, maybe a dozen men total, armed but hardly a fighting force, and they run straight into a German patrol, not a major unit, just a few German soldiers who are probably as surprised as the Americans, but the Germans have the drop on them, weapons pointed, shouts in German, the universal language of surrender. And here it happens, the moment that should have been impossible. Brigadier General Alan W. Jones, commander of the 106th Infantry Division, raises his hands in surrender. A German soldier, probably a sergeant, probably can't believe his eyes when he sees the stars on Jones's uniform. They've captured a general, an actual American general. It's a propaganda coup beyond anything they could have hoped for. Except wait, here's where the historical record gets murky and we need to be really careful. Because I've just told you a version of events that makes for a dramatic story. But here's the truth. The exact circumstances of what happened to General Jones during the Battle of the Bulge are disputed and unclear. Some accounts say he was briefly captured and then escaped, or was recaptured by American forces almost immediately. Other accounts say he was never personally captured at all, though he came very close to it during the chaotic retreat. The official military records are frustratingly vague on this point. What we know for certain is this. Jones was evacuated from his command on December 22nd, just 6 days after the battle began. He was relieved of command. His division had been destroyed, his son was a prisoner, and his superiors decided he needed to be removed from the battlefield. Some sources describe him as being in a state of near collapse, physically and emotionally exhausted, possibly suffering from what we'd now call combat stress reaction. He was sent to a hospital in Paris and later returned to the United States. He never commanded troops in combat again. So did Jones actually become a prisoner, even briefly, during those chaotic days? The evidence is fragmentary and contradictory. What we can say is that he was in extreme danger of capture multiple times during the retreat from St. Vith. His headquarters was overrun. He was moving through areas where German forces were operating. Several officers from his staff were captured. It's entirely possible that in the confusion, Jones was briefly detained by German forces before American units retook the area or before anyone realized they had a general on their hands. War is chaotic. Records are incomplete. Not everything that happens gets properly documented, especially in the middle of a disaster. But you know what? Whether Jones was technically captured for a few minutes or a few hours, or whether he just came terrifyingly close to it, isn't really the point. The deeper story here is about the catastrophe that engulfed the 106th Division and the impossible position Jones found himself in. Let's talk about what happened to those 9,000 men who surrendered on the Schnee Eifel. They were marched east into Germany, into prisoner of war camps. Many of them would spend the next 5 months in brutal conditions, starving, freezing, watching their comrades die of disease and malnutrition. Young Lieutenant Alan Jones Jr. was among them. He survived barely and was liberated in April 1945 when Allied forces overran the camp where he was held. He came home weighing probably 50 pounds less than when he was captured, traumatized, but alive. General Jones lived until 1969, 25 years after the Battle of the Bulge, and during those 25 years he had to live with the questions, the what-ifs, the accusations. Could he have saved those 2 regiments if he'd ordered them to withdraw earlier? Was he too slow to react, too indecisive? Did his worry about his son cloud his judgment? Military historians have argued about these questions for decades. Some defend Jones, saying he was following doctrine, that he didn't have the full picture of how bad the situation was, that no one could have prevented the disaster given the overwhelming German superiority in that sector. Others are more critical, saying the signs were there, that a more aggressive commander would have pulled those regiments back before they were completely surrounded. Here's what I think, and this is just my opinion after reading everything I could find about this. Jones was handed an impossible situation. His division was green, inexperienced, spread too thin over too much ground. The German attack was larger and more powerful than anyone anticipated. The failure wasn't really Jones's alone. It was a systemic failure of Allied intelligence, of command decisions made way above his pay grade, of the overconfidence that led to the Ardennes being treated as a quiet sector in the first place. Jones was the guy left holding the bag when everything went wrong. But he was also a father who had to give orders knowing his son might die because of them. And that's a burden I can't even begin to imagine. When Jones was reunited with his son after the war, after Junior came home from that POW camp, what do you think they said to each other? Did they talk about it? Did Junior blame his father? Did Jones apologize? Or did they just hug and cry and try to move forward without ever addressing the elephant in the room? We'll never know. Some conversations happen in private and stay private. The Battle of the Bulge, by the way, turned out to be Hitler's last gasp. The German offensive eventually stalled. American reinforcements poured into the area. Patton's Third Army came up from the south. The weather cleared and Allied air power returned. By the end of January 1945, the Germans were pushed back to where they started, having achieved nothing except killing a lot of people and losing tanks and soldiers they couldn't afford to lose. The war in Europe ended less than 5 months later. But for the 106th Infantry Division, the Battle of the Bulge was an extinction event. Of the roughly 15,000 men in the division when the battle started, about 9,000 were captured, killed, or missing. The division was effectively destroyed and had to be completely rebuilt. The survivors, the ones who made it through, carried the psychological scars for the rest of their lives. Many of them refused to talk about what happened. It was too painful, too traumatic. There's a bigger lesson here about war and command and the weight of responsibility. We like to think of generals as these godlike figures who control events from their headquarters, moving units around like chess pieces. But the reality is messier and more human. Generals are people. They make decisions with incomplete information, under enormous pressure, knowing that people will die because of what they choose to do or not do. They feel fear and doubt just like anyone else. And when things go catastrophically wrong, they have to live with that for the rest of their lives. Alan W. Jones wasn't a bad general. He wasn't incompetent or cowardly. He was a decent officer who got caught in a perfect storm of bad circumstances. The German attack was bigger than anyone expected. His division was too inexperienced and too spread out. The communications broke down. The relief never came. The weather didn't cooperate. 1,000 things had to go wrong all at the same time, and they did. And he was the man in charge when it happened, so his name is the one attached to the disaster. Think about the other officers and men who were captured during the Battle of the Bulge. Thousands of American soldiers ended up as prisoners during those chaotic December days. Tank crews overrun by German panzers. Infantry companies surrounded and forced to surrender, medics captured while treating wounded. Every one of them has a story. Every one of them faced fear and uncertainty and the degradation of captivity. But we remember the story of the general because of what it represents. The idea that even the highest ranks weren't safe from the chaos of war, that the disaster was so complete that even the commanders weren't immune. Now I want to circle back to something important. Earlier I told you that the exact details of Jones's possible capture are unclear, and I want to be really honest about why that matters. As storytellers and history enthusiasts, we have a responsibility to be accurate. It's tempting to embellish, to make the story more dramatic, to fill in gaps with what seems plausible. But when we're talking about real people, real events, real suffering, we owe it to them to stick to what we actually know. General Jones and his son and those 9,000 soldiers of the 106th Division were real people who went through something horrific. Their story is dramatic enough without needing to invent details. What we know for sure is that Jones came very close to capture, possibly closer than any other American general in the European theater. We know his headquarters was overrun. We know he was evacuated in a state of physical and emotional exhaustion. We know he lost his division and his son was captured. Those facts alone tell a powerful story about command, responsibility, and the human cost of war. After the war, the 106th Infantry Division Association was formed by survivors of the battle. They held reunions, published newsletters, tried to make sense of what happened to them. Many of them spent years trying to clear their names and the name of their division from the stigma of surrender. They wanted people to understand that they hadn't quit, hadn't given up easily. They'd been surrounded, outnumbered, out of ammunition, and out of options. They fought as long as they could, and then made the hardest choice a soldier can make. General Jones attended some of these reunions in later years. Imagine how hard that must have been, facing the men who served under him, men who spent months in POW camps, men whose friends died in the snow or in the camps. What do you say to them? How do you explain the decisions you made? How do you ask for forgiveness or give it to yourself? There's a memorial now at the Schnee Eifel where those two regiments made their last stand. It's in the forest, where the foxholes and fighting positions are still visible if you know where to look. The stone memorial lists the units that fought there and the ones that didn't come back. It's a quiet place now, peaceful. The forest has reclaimed most of the scars. But if you stand there and really think about what happened, about 9,000 young men surrounded in the snow, running out of everything, waiting for help that never came, it'll break your heart. One more thing I want to mention. Lieutenant Allen Jones Jr., the general's son, he did come home from that POW camp. He stayed in the army after the war. Can you believe that? After everything he went through, after being captured, after nearly starving to death in a German prison camp, he continued his military career. Maybe it was a way of processing what happened. Maybe it was loyalty to his father. Maybe it was just what he knew how to do. He eventually retired as a colonel. He lived a long life. He never spoke publicly about his father's decisions during the Battle of the Bulge, at least not that I could find. Some things stay in the family. So what's the takeaway from all this? Why does this story matter 80 years later? I think it matters because it reminds us that history isn't just dates and battles and movements of armies on maps. It's people. It's a father trying to save his division while knowing his son is in danger. It's young soldiers shivering in foxholes waiting for orders. It's impossible decisions made with incomplete information. It's living with the consequences of those decisions for the rest of your life. It's courage and fear and failure and survival all mixed together in a way that's complicated and human and real. The Battle of the Bulge was the largest battle the United States Army ever fought. Over 600,000 American soldiers were involved. About 90,000 became casualties, killed, wounded, or captured. It was fought in brutal winter conditions, in dense forests, in tiny Belgian and Luxembourg villages whose names most Americans had never heard before. it lasted 6 weeks. And when it was over, the Germans had lost their last reserve of strength, and the end of the war was inevitable. But for the men of the 106th Infantry Division, and especially for General Allen W. Jones and his son, the Battle of the Bulge was something more personal and more painful. It was a family tragedy played out on the stage of World War. It was a cautionary tale about the limits of command and the weight of responsibility. It was a reminder that in war, even the generals aren't safe from catastrophe. Did General Jones actually spend time as a German prisoner? The evidence suggests he came extremely close, that he was in German-controlled territory during the retreat, that his small party was nearly captured multiple times, and that in the chaos, it's entirely possible he was briefly detained before American forces stabilized the situation. But the exact sequence of events will probably never be fully known. The fog of war is real, and it doesn't lift just because decades have passed and historians want clear answers. What we can say with certainty is that Jones experienced the nightmare scenario for any military commander. His division was destroyed. His son was captured. He was relieved of command. He spent the rest of his life under a cloud of questions about whether he could have done something different, something better, something that would have saved those 9,000 men from the Schnee Eifel. And the answer, the honest answer, is probably no. Not given the situation he was in, not given what he knew at the time, not given the overwhelming force that hit his sector. But that doesn't make the burden any lighter to carry. War produces these stories, these terrible, human, complicated stories where there are no clear villains except maybe war itself, and no clear heroes except the ordinary people trying to survive and do their duty under impossible circumstances. The capture of a general, or the near capture of a general, becomes symbolic of the larger catastrophe. It represents how completely things fell apart during those first days of the German offensive, how the mighty were brought low, how even rank and position offered no protection from the chaos. So the next time you see a documentary or read a book about the Battle of the Bulge, remember this story. Remember the 106th Infantry Division. Remember General Jones and his son. Remember the 9,000 men who surrendered on the Schnee Eifel, not because they were cowards, but because they were soldiers who fought until they had nothing left to fight with. Remember that every unit marker on a battle map represents real people with real families making real sacrifices. And remember that sometimes the most interesting stories aren't about the victories and the heroes. Sometimes the most interesting stories are about the failures and the tragedies and the people who had to live with them afterward. Because those are the stories that show us what war really costs. Not just in lives lost on the battlefield, but in guilt carried for decades, in relationships broken by decisions made under pressure, in the weight of command that some men carry to their grave. General Allen W. Jones died in 1969. He was 79 years old. He's buried in Arlington National Cemetery. His son, Colonel Allen W. Jones Jr., died in 1998. He's buried there too, father and son, both soldiers, both survivors of the Battle of the Bulge in their own ways, both carrying memories of those terrible December days in 1944 when everything fell apart in the frozen forests of Belgium. Their story, whether it includes a formal capture or just the near miss of capture, is one of the most poignant and human stories to come out of World War II. It deserves to be remembered, not sensationalized, not simplified, but remembered in all its complicated, painful, very human truth.